Welcome to another chapter of our long and soothing, boring history series, created to help you relax, unwind, and drift away into calmness while listening to gentle storytelling that takes you far from the rush of your day. And before we begin today's journey, I would love to invite you to be part of this growing community by supporting the channel. So if you enjoyed these long, peaceful, and boring history videos that are carefully written to quiet the mind and guide you into rest, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because your support helps us bring even more stories and chapters for you to enjoy, and I would love to hear from you as well. So tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Whether it is late at night and you are lying down trying to fall asleep, or whether it is during the quiet hours of the early morning, or even in the middle of the day when you just want some calm background storytelling. Your comments always inspire me and remind me that people all around the world are connected here by the shared experience of listening. So take a moment to introduce yourself and let me know your time and place. And now, let's settle in. Take a deep breath, make yourself comfortable, and begin our slow journey together into today's story. When you begin to imagine the life of a medieval prisoner, you must begin not with noise or action, not with clashing swords or shouting guards, but with the slowness of silence itself. For silence is the true master of the dungeon, and it is within silence that time stretches, bends, and eventually loses its meaning. So let us move slowly now, step by step, into this underground world, pausing with each detail, not to rush, but to let every element of the scene reveal itself in its own time, because that is how the dungeon reveals itself to those who live within it. Not in sudden shocks, but in the long unfolding of quiet hours. And as you descend the narrow stone steps, your hand brushing against the cold wall, you notice how the air thickens, cooler and heavier with every step, until it feels as though you are breathing through a damp cloth. And with each inhalation, you taste minerals, rust, and the faint tints of mold, and while your ears strain for some sound of life, all that reaches you is the gentle dripping of water from unseen cracks in the ceiling, each drop falling with patient regularity into shallow puddles that scatter across the uneven floor. And this drip becomes not simply background noise, but a metronome, marking the passage of moments in a place where sunlight does not enter and clocks do not exist. And as you walk further into this place, you notice how the torchlight at the far end flickers weakly, barely strong enough to push back the shadows that cling stubbornly to every corner, so that the shapes of the stones themselves seem alive, shifting slightly with each tremor of the flame. And if you pause long enough, the silence deepens until you begin to hear things you would not notice above ground. The faint scuttle of rats along the edges of the chamber, the soft rustle of straw as a prisoner shifts his weight on the floor, the faint groan of the wooden beams that support the heavy stone overhead. And through all of this, silence continues to reign, thick and unbroken, so complete that even the smallest noise seems magnified. And it is within this soundscape that the prisoner must learn to exist. Because day after day, week after week, the silence becomes his most faithful companion, always present, always heavy, never truly kind, but never absent either. And so the prisoner begins to know silence, not as a void, but as a kind of presence, a weight that presses on the chest, a veil that muffles every thought. And within that veil, the mind turns inward, replaying memories again and again, stretching out regrets like long shadows, and imagining futures that will never arrive. And yet, in the same way, silence also teaches the prisoner to survive. For once the initial fear and restlessness pass, once the body has accepted the stillness of confinement, the silence becomes a strange teacher, showing how to pay attention to the smallest details, how to mark time by listening to the rhythm of dripping water, how to create patterns out of chains rattling when the wind creeps in through the iron grate. How to find comfort in the sameness of each day, because sameness is predictable, and in predictability lies a form of safety. And so, we may imagine the prisoner leaning back against the wall, the rough stones cold against his spine, eyes half closed as he breathed slowly, listening not for words, but for the rhythm of the dungeon itself, the in-breath and out-breath of silence, the eternal patience of stone. And in that stillness, he drifts, not awake, not asleep, but suspended, carried along by the gentle monotony that replaces the chaos of the outside world. And though he cannot see the sky, he comes to sense the passage of time in subtle ways, perhaps by the faint warmth that sometimes seeps down through the cracks above when the sun is high, or by the slightly cooler air that enters when night falls, or by the footsteps of guards making their rounds, their boots clattering faintly and then fading away into nothing. And over time, these rhythms become his calendar, his only means of knowing that time continues, that the world above still turns, even though he does not witness it. And in this way, silence both isolates and connects, keeping him apart from the world, yet reminding him through these tiny changes that the world still exists beyond the stone walls. And as days become weeks, he learns to endure by embracing the silence, by letting it seep into his thoughts rather than fighting it, by treating it not as emptiness, but as a companion, steady and unyielding. And though it offers no comfort, it also offers no betrayal. For silence is loyal. Silence does not abandon. Silence remains, just as the stones remain, immovable and eternal. And so the prisoner breathes with the dungeon, listens to the heartbeat of dripping water, and survives one moment, then another, until the long chain of days stretches out, stone by stone, silence by silence, breath by breath, into a kind of existence that is not freedom, but is still life. And in the deep quiet of the dungeon, life, even in its most reduced form, continues. To truly understand the life of a medieval prisoner, one must begin to notice not only the silence, but also the very stones that surrounded him. For in these underground chambers, stone was more than material. It was an unspoken authority. It was both the builder and the warden, shaping not only the room, but also the mind of the captive. And so, let us linger with the walls themselves, not hurrying to leave them, but examining carefully, stone by stone, the weight of their presence. For each wall was made of rough blocks hewn from quarries, lifted by laborers, and set one upon another with the slow patience that reflected the permanence intended by their builders. And when you leaned your back against such a wall, you would feel at once its chill, a dampness that never left, even in the heat of summer. And the prisoner who pressed his palm against a stone might notice tiny beads of moisture clinging there, as though the wall itself were weeping slowly, not with sorrow, but simply with the endless seep of underground water that found its way through cracks. And when the prisoner ran his fingers across the wall, he would feel sharp ridges where mortars had crumbled, small cavities where insects sometimes hid, and patches of slimy moss or lichen that grew in the dim light. And though the walls did not move, they were never entirely lifeless, for the damp air gave them a kind of slow breath, so that each wall seemed to exhale coldness steadily, drawing warmth from the skin of anyone who touched it. And so, over time, the walls became not only a physical boundary, but also a living presence, a constant companion that pressed upon the prisoner day and night, reminding him with every glance, every touch, that escape was not possible. And yet, in their heaviness, the walls also created a peculiar form of security, because while they confined, they also protected, shielding the prisoner from the chaos outside, from storms and winds, from armies that marched beyond the town, from the unpredictable swirl of life. And in that way, the prisoner, while cursing the walls, also came to depend on them, leaning against them in exhaustion, resting his head upon them when sleep came fitfully, scratching marks into them to count the days, and speaking softly to them when no one else could hear. And it is within this contradiction that the medieval dungeon revealed itself most clearly, for the very things that imprisoned also preserved, the very stones that stole freedom also gave shelter. Hey, and in this balance the prisoner learned to endure. When light struck the walls, it did so weakly, filtered through narrow slits or bouncing off torches. And so the surfaces were rarely seen in full brightness. Instead, they appeared in fragments, a glint here, a patch there, with shadows pooling in every gap. And in such conditions, the walls sometimes seemed to shift, not literally, but in the perception of a weary mind, so that lines blurred, stones loomed larger, corners bent inwards, and as the prisoner stared for hours at the same stretch of wall, details began to emerge that he had not noticed before. Small scratches left by previous captives, initials carved with patience during long nights, or crude drawings of animals, ships, and crosses. Each mark a quiet voice speaking across time, reminding him that he was not the first to sit in this place, and not the last. And as he traced those carvings with his fingers, he might imagine the hands that made them. Rough hands, calloused from labor, hands trembling with cold or hunger, hands perhaps chained at the wrist, but still able to scratch a message into stone. And in this way, the walls became a book of memory, not written in ink, but in grooves and cuts, a book whose pages the prisoner read slowly, over and over, because, in the absence of parchment or candlelight, these were the only words left to him. The weight of the walls was not only physical, however, it was also mental, for every hour spent inside them stretched longer than it would outside, and the prisoner could not walk freely, could not look out at the horizon, could not stretch his body under the open sky, and so his thoughts circled endlessly, bouncing from stone to stone, just as his eyes did, and soon the walls became mirrors, reflecting his own mind back at him, until he began to hear his own voice echo faintly, not aloud, but inside, carried by the silence, so that he could no longer tell whether he was thinking or remembering, whether he was awake or dozing, whether he was strong or already broken. And this is the true weight of the walls, the way they pressed not only on the body, but on the spirit, bending time, bending thought, until everything slowed to the pace of dripping water and flickering firelight. And yet, in time, the prisoner adjusted, because human beings, even in the harshest conditions, find ways to adapt. And so he came to treat the walls as companions, sometimes enemies, sometimes protectors, sometimes teachers. And as he leaned back, closing his eyes, feeling the cool stone against his skin, he learned to listen not only to silence, but to the story of the walls themselves. For they too carried memory. They too had stood through centuries, and in their roughness, their weight, and their stillness, they taught him the patience needed to survive. In the dungeon, time did not move as it does in the world above, did not follow the rhythm of bells ringing from church towers or the sound of merchants calling in the market. Instead, time moved like water dripping steadily from a crack in the ceiling, slow, uneven, difficult to measure, and yet impossible to ignore. And for the prisoner, who had nothing to do but sit, wait, and breathe, the slow passing of time became not just a background fact, but the central experience of his life, shaping his days, his nights, and his very sense of being. So, let us settle into this experience and follow the way a single day might unfold for such a man, noting the smallest details, stretching them out as he would have stretched them out in his mind, making hours from minutes and days from hours, till the length itself became unbearable and yet strangely soothing in its predictability, because monotony, while cruel, also brought with it a kind of rhythm that the body and mind could cling to. The day might begin not with the sound of a rooster or the warmth of sunlight on the face, but with the faint rattle of chains as the prisoner shifted on the straw, or with the sound of a guard's footsteps echoing in the corridor, heavy boots on stone, sometimes pausing near the door, sometimes moving past, and that sound alone might tell the prisoner whether food was coming, or whether the day was to begin without any sign of human presence. And if food did come, it might be nothing more than a wooden bowl pushed across the floor containing a thin soup, or a chunk of bread so hard it needed to be soaked before it could be chewed. And yet, for the prisoner, this small act of eating became an event, a marker of time, a ceremony around which thoughts gathered. And so he might spend long minutes simply looking at the crust, smelling it, tearing it slowly, delaying the moment of swallowing so that the act of eating stretched into something larger, something that carried him across the wide emptiness of morning. After eating, there was often nothing but waiting, sitting against the wall, shifting from one position to another, listening to the creak of wood above, or the scurrying of rats along the corners. And during this waiting, the prisoner would sometimes count the drips of water, using them as a kind of clock. Though the drips were not regular, sometimes close together, sometimes far apart, and so the counting was never precise, but perhaps that imprecision was the point. For in such a place, precision lost its meaning. The day was not measured in hours, but in sounds and silences, in hunger and fullness, in wakefulness and drowsiness. And so time dissolved into sensations, which blurred into one another until the prisoner no longer knew whether it was morning, afternoon, or evening. The only other way to measure time was through light, and in some dungeons even that was denied. But in others, a thin shaft of sun might fall through a slit high in the wall, too narrow to reveal the sky, but wide enough to show a shifting bar of brightness across the stones, and the prisoner would watch that bar with intensity, noting how it crept slowly downward, then disappeared altogether. And in that vanishing, the prisoner understood that another day had passed, though he had done nothing to mark it except observe. Night came not with stars or moonlight, but with thick darkness, and in that darkness the prisoner might lie awake for long stretches, not because he wished to, but because the body, unexercised, unoccupied, refused to sink easily into deep rest. And so sleep came in fragments, short bursts interrupted by waking, by coughing, by the rustle of straw, by the scuttling of vermin. And each time he woke, he felt as though no time had passed at all, as though he had been caught in the same endless night forever. And yet slowly, almost without noticing, the prisoner adjusted to this rhythm, so that one day flowed into another, like water flowing into water, without boundary, without distinction. And weeks became months in the mind without any clear sign of transition. This slow passing of time was not simply endured, but also transformed by the prisoner's imagination, for the mind, when left alone, will begin to wander. And so the prisoner might find himself recalling memories of fields, of rivers, of faces, long unseen, and he might dwell on these memories with such intensity that they seemed to stretch outward, killing the dungeon with echoes of places that were not there. And in this way, a single memory of a walk along a village road might occupy him 4 hours, replayed in detail, step by step, each stone, each tree, each voice recalled as though he were reliving it. And this act of remembering became another way to measure time, not by what happened in the dungeon, but by what had once happened outside, by the life that was suspended, but not forgotten. At other times, imagination turned forward instead of backward, and the prisoner might think of release, of walking again under the sun, of hearing birds in the morning. And though such thoughts were painful, they also gave shape to the empty hours, filling them with visions of what might be. And so both memory and hope stretched out across the silence, like bridges across an endless plain, carrying the prisoner from one long hour to the next. And still, time remained slow, slower than anything else he had ever known. And this slowness itself became the most difficult part of survival. Because pain could be borne if it was sharp and brief. Hunger could be endured if it ended with a meal, but endless waiting, endless monotony, pressed upon the spirit in a way that was harder to resist. And yet resist he did, by making rituals from the smallest acts, by dividing the day into tiny sections, by carving notches into stone, by repeating prayers, by humming songs, by whispering names of loved ones, by tracing patterns on the floor. Each act not significant in itself, but made significant by the role it played in shaping time, in slowing the slow passage into something he could manage. In this way, the medieval prisoner did not so much fight time as reshape it, turning its weight into something that, though heavy, could be borne. And in that slow passing, he discovered not only endurance, but also a strange stillness, a stillness that was harsh yet calming, painful yet quiet, a stillness in which survival was possible because the mind, though trapped, could expand, wandering freely, even as the body remained chained. And so the days and nights, though nearly indistinguishable, folded one after another, stone by stone, breath by breath, in the long, slow rhythm of survival. In the medieval dungeon, silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, thick, heavy, and pressing down on the prisoner like an unseen hand. Because in the world above, silence is usually broken by the natural rhythms of life, the clatter of tools in the workshop, the laughter of children in the streets, the calls of sellers in the market, or the distant toll of church bells marking the hours. But in the dungeon, none of those markers remained, and so silence took on the density, filling every crevice of stone, every breath of stale air, every pause between the occasional footsteps of guards or the scrape of a rat across the floor. For the prisoner trapped within, this silence was not a momentary pause, but a constant companion shaping his thoughts, his feelings, his very way of experiencing existence. The silence could make even the smallest sound startling, so that the distant creak of a door opening somewhere above felt like thunder, or the faint drip of water landing in a puddle seemed louder than a shout, and the mind, deprived of ordinary noise, amplified whatever faint disturbances did occur, clinging to them as if they were lifelines, stretching them out, turning them into events of great importance, because they reminded the prisoner that the outside world still existed beyond the stone walls. Yet for the most part, silence returned again and again, swallowing all. And in that silence, the prisoner found himself listening to things he would never have noticed otherwise. The rhythm of his own heartbeat, the sound of his breath as it moved in and out, the creak of his own joints as he shifted on the straw, and at times he even spoke aloud to himself just to fill the emptiness, repeating words or phrases, whispering prayers, reciting fragments of stories, anything to create a sound that might push back against the oppressive stillness. But even those self-made sounds quickly died, absorbed by the damp stone, leaving him once more alone with the silence. In such conditions, silence could become almost unbearable, not simply because it was quiet, but because it left the prisoner face to face with his own thoughts, and thoughts, when not distracted by noise or activity, could grow large and overwhelming, memories replayed endlessly, fears magnified, regrets sharpened until they cut. And so the silence was not peaceful, but demanding, drawing the prisoner inward, whether he wished it or not. At the same time, however, silence also became a strange form of teacher, because in listening so long and so deeply to the absence of sound, the prisoner began to notice subtle shifts, like the way the air felt different at night compared to the day, cooler, more still, or the way distant echoes traveled differently depending on the moisture in the air. And these tiny perceptions gave him a way of connecting to the passage of time, a way of orienting himself within the endless quiet. Silence also heightened his sensitivity to life, so that the small noises of creatures, the soft scratch of a mouse searching for crumbs, the flutter of a bat disturbed in the darkness, became companions, even comforts, reminding him that he was not completely alone, that life still persisted in small ways, even in such a forgotten place. In this way, the prisoner's relationship with silence was not only one of suffering, but also one of adaptation, because though silence weighed on him heavily at first, pressing his spirit down, over time he learned to settle into it, to accept its presence, and even to find within it a peculiar rhythm, a rhythm that echoed the slow pace of his days, the steady repetition of breath and heartbeat, the endless drip of water. And in that rhythm he sometimes found a strange stillness, not pleasant exactly, but steady, a kind of background against which his mind could rest. The silence was also broken occasionally by the intervention of guards, and these interruptions, though brief, served as reminders of how deeply silence dominated the rest of his time, because the simple sound of keys jingling, or the scrape of a door being opened, or a voice ordering him to stand, seemed almost overwhelming after hours of nothing. And even if the words were harsh or the actions cruel, they still carried with them a sense of contact, of being noticed, and so the prisoner might long for them even while dreading them, because they pierced the silence and proved that he was still part of the world of human voices. But once the guards left, silence would rush back in like a tide, filling the space with even greater force, as though to remind him that his true companion was not other people, but the void of sound that surrounded him. Over months and years, this weight of silence shaped the prisoner's very way of thinking, slowing his thoughts down, making them stretch. Because, without external noise to push his mind from one subject to another, he lingered over single ideas for hours, circling them, examining them, turning them over, until even the smallest memory or question became vast. And in this way, silence did not only press on him, but also opened him, making space for his mind to wander in ways it never had before. Sometimes that wandering was painful, leading him into regrets or fears. But sometimes it was soothing, carrying him back into gentle memories of home, of childhood, of simpler times. And in those moments, silence became less an enemy and more a doorway, a space through which the past returned and comforted him, however briefly. Silence in the dungeon, then, was never simple. It was at once cruel and kind, heavy and light, oppressive and strangely freeing. And learning to live with it was one of the most difficult and most important parts of survival, because a man who could not bear silence would go mad. But a man who could learn to settle into it might endure for years, finding within its weight a stillness that, though harsh, was livable, stone by stone, breath by breath, in the long rhythm of time that defined the dungeon. Hunger in the dungeon was not a sudden pang that came and went like the hunger we know after skipping a meal, but instead it was a slow and enduring companion. It's a constant shadow that followed the prisoner from the first moments of confinement to the last, shaping not only the body but also the mind, because meals in these places were not truly meals as we think of them, but rather scraps, fragments, and sometimes nothing at all. And so the prisoner learned to live with an ache in the belly that never fully went away, a hollow place inside that grew sharper at first and then dulled into a background hum, always there, always present, guiding every thought and feeling, changing the very rhythm of life, so that every day was marked not by sunrise or sunset, which were unseen beneath stone, but by the possibility of food, by the hope of something being pushed through the small gap in the door or lowered on a rope from above. And the mind became so fixed on this that hours passed not in anticipation of freedom or escape, but in waiting for the sound of footsteps that might bring a crust of bread or a cup of thin broth. And when those sounds did come, The heart leaped as though salvation were at hand, only to fall again when the portion was too small, too stale, too spoiled, and yet it was accepted anyway, because the hunger was always greater than the disgust. In time, the prisoner's relationship with food changed entirely. Because in ordinary life, a meal carries with it taste, texture, warmth, variety, and even the comfort of companionship. But in the dungeon, those things vanished, and food became only survival, stripped of joy, stripped of satisfaction, stripped of choice. And so, the prisoner ate, slowly, carefully, savoring every crumb, because there might not be another for many hours. And because, in those brief moments of eating, the hunger lifted slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of relief, a momentary peace before the ache returned again. The body, deprived of nourishment, changed, too. First losing weight as muscles wasted, then slowing down as energy faded, so that even small movements felt heavy, and the prisoner found himself resting more often, conserving every bit of strength, because hunger was not just in the stomach, but in the bones, in the breath, in the very way the body moved through space. This slow weakening taught him to measure every action, to ask himself before shifting on the straw or walking to the corner of the cell, whether the effort was worth it, whether the energy should be saved. And in this way, hunger became not just a feeling, but a discipline, shaping daily life with invisible hands. Hunger also changed the mind, narrowing thoughts until food became the central image of imagination, so that even while trying to remember loved ones, or trying to pray, or trying to focus on some other detail of memory, the mind slipped back to food, picturing bread, soup, cheese, meat, imagining feasts once taken for granted, the smell of baking, the warmth of stew, the sweetness of fruit, and these memories brought both comfort and pain. Comfort, because they reminded him of better times, and pain, because they highlighted the sharp contrast with the present emptiness. Sometimes, prisoners spoke aloud about food, carrying memories of meals like currency, cribing to each other the way roasted meat smelled on a festival day, or how butter melted on warm bread. And these conversations, though painful, also provided a strange relief, as if by sharing the memory of food, they could taste it again in some small way, feeding the mind, if not the body. And yet, after the words faded, the hunger always returned, heavier than before. Hunger also had the power to bend the prisoner's sense of time, because hours without food stretched endlessly, each minute slowed by the constant ache, while the moments of eating passed quickly, far too quickly, so that the day seemed to expand and contract around the presence or absence of nourishment, and soon the prisoner no longer knew whether it was morning or evening, whether days had passed or weeks, only that the hunger had not left, and that it was the one constant marker of existence. This hunger was not always equal, for sometimes, depending on the generosity or cruelty of guards, a prisoner might receive slightly more, perhaps an extra crust of bread, and the joy of such a gift was immense, far greater than the gift itself, because it offered a temporary sense of plenty, of fullness, a fleeting moment when the belly did not ache and the body felt almost alive again. But these moments were rare, and often they were followed by long stretches of less, as if to balance the scales, reminding the prisoner not to expect kindness, not to rely on hope, but simply to endure. Over months and years, hunger became more than physical. It became spiritual, teaching lessons that no teacher could have prepared. Lessons about patience, about humility, about the fragility of the body and the persistence of the will, because, though the body wasted, the will to survive clung to even the smallest scrap, finding meaning in a mouthful of water or a handful of gruel. And in this way, hunger, though cruel, became a partner in endurance, forcing the prisoner to learn what it meant to live with less, and still less, until life itself seemed to exist on almost nothing. Hunger also blurred the boundaries between waking and sleeping, because at night the ache in the belly kept the prisoner half awake, drifting in shallow rest, and when dreams came, they were often dreams of food, vivid dreams of tables set with plenty of markets filled with abundance, only to dissolve into waking emptiness. And yet, even these dreams were clung to, cherished, because they provided at least some moments of relief, even if only in the imagination. In some dungeons, prisoners carved marks into the walls to count days, and the size of the portion received became the measure of those days. A small meal marking 1, 2, 3 days survived, the hunger itself becoming the calendar, the rhythm of time. Hunger also stripped away pride, because a man who might once have demanded the finest dishes at home would, in the dungeon, bend low to pick crumbs from the dirt, would lick the last drop of broth from a wooden bowl, would chew old straw in desperate attempts to trick the stomach into believing it had received something. And though at first this felt shameful, over time it became simply survival, and the prisoner no longer thought of dignity, but only of living one more day, one more week, one more month. Hunger even blurred the line between man and beast, because the prisoner watched the rats eat boldly in the corners and envied them, seeing how they scurried over scraps and gnawed freely while he sat empty, waiting for whatever might come. And sometimes he fought them, not only to keep them from stealing his crumbs, but to claim their share for himself. And in those moments, the hunger was not only painful, but fierce, driving him to struggle for morsels that would once have been beneath notice. Hunger became, in this way, the dungeon's constant law, greater than stone, greater than chains, because it touched every part of existence, body, mind, and spirit, reminding the prisoner each moment of what he lacked, yet also showing him how much he could endure, how much life could continue even with almost nothing, stone by stone, breath by breath, crumb by crumb, in the long and endless rhythm of the dungeon. Silence in the dungeon was not the soft or peaceful quiet one might seek in a library or a temple, but instead it was a deep, heavy, and almost suffocating presence that pressed against the ears and the mind. Silence so thick it felt like another wall within the prison. And though at times there were sounds, the dripping of water, the scurrying of rats, the faint shuffle of a guard's boots, those sounds only made the silence feel greater when they ended, because their absence returned the prisoner to a void where no voice spoke, no music played, no laughter echoed, only the breath of his own body, the beating of his own heart, and even those seemed loud in contrast to the great emptiness around him. And so the silence was both companion and tormentor, stretching across the long hours until days and nights became indistinguishable. In ordinary life, silence may be broken by choice, by speech or song, but in the dungeon, silence ruled. And the prisoner learned how powerful silence could be. Not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of nothingness. And in that nothingness, thoughts grew louder, memories sharpened, and the inner voice of the mind spoke constantly, sometimes whispering comfort, sometimes replaying conversations from the past, and sometimes inventing new dialogues just to fill the void, so that the prisoner found himself talking inside his head. Two people long gone, two friends unseen, even two enemies, creating arguments or reconciliations that could never occur. And though this brought a strange sense of company, it also deepened the realization that he was truly alone. Silence in the dungeon was also broken at times by cries. And these cries were not his own, but came from unseen neighbors. Men or women locked in other cells, their voices rising suddenly in pain, despair, or madness. And though the walls muffled, dim, the sound traveled enough to remind him that others were there, suffering as he suffered, unseen yet present, and their cries haunted him. For after the cries came silence again. And he wondered whether that silence meant exhaustion unconsciousness, or death. And in this way, silence was never neutral. It was always filled with questions, with fears, with the weight of possibilities. There were also times when silence grew so overwhelming that even the smallest sound became startling. The scrape of a pebble, the rustle of straws, the flutter of a bat's wings, each magnified to unnatural proportions by the emptiness around it. And in those moments, the prisoner felt as though the silence itself were listening, waiting, surrounding him like a living thing. Over weeks and months, silence began to play tricks on the senses, for when the ears were denied sound, the mind began to create it. And so he heard whispers that were not there, footsteps that never came, the faint murmur of voices he could almost recognize but could never quite reach. And though he knew these were illusions, the product of a starved mind in a soundless world, they still felt real. And sometimes he found himself answering them aloud, breaking the silence with his own voice, just to prove he could still speak, still hear something real. But his voice echoed strangely in the narrow chamber, sounding foreign, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Speaking aloud became both a comfort and a test, a way of reminding himself of language, of sound, of identity. Because in the long silence, the prisoner sometimes feared he might forget how to speak. Tact, his voice might vanish as unused muscles withered. And so he whispered to himself, recited prayers, repeated names of loved ones, even sang softly when strength allowed, not for joy, but for survival, for proof that silence had not entirely claimed him. Yet the silence always returned, vast and unbroken, stretching longer each day until it felt eternal. And in that eternity, the prisoner confronted not only loneliness, but himself, his thoughts, his regrets, his memories, and his fears, because without distraction, there was nothing to shield him from the mind's contents. And every mistake, every loss, every moment of sorrow came back again, replayed endlessly in the stillness, demanding attention, forcing reflection. And though this was painful, it also shaped him, teaching endurance, patience, and a strange kind of acceptance. Silence also became a mirror of time itself, because without sound, hours blended into one another, and the prisoner could not measure when night ended or day began. So silence was the clock, endless and unchanging, marking the rhythm of existence. In the dungeon, where each pause between scraps of noise seemed infinite, and each return of sound, however small, seemed miraculous. There were even moments when the prisoner discovered a strange peace in silence, because in its depth he found space to think, to breathe, to separate himself from the cruelty of guards and the chaos of the world outside. And though he never chose it, silence became a teacher, revealing how little was needed for survival, how much of life could exist even in stillness, and how the human spirit could create its own voices, its own songs, its own conversations, when the world refused to provide them. The silence of stone was thus both torment and tutor, enemy and companion, crushing yet revealing, reminding the prisoner with every breath that though the dungeon had stolen sound, it had not stolen the mind, and within the mind there was still movement, still life, still resilience, carrying him through the endless, unbroken quiet of captivity. Chains in the medieval dungeon were not simply tools of restraint. They were an unspoken language of power, a constant reminder that the prisoner's body no longer belonged to him, but to the authority that had locked him away. And from the first moment iron was placed on the wrists, ankles, or neck, life was changed. Every movement slowed, every gesture measured, every breath accompanied by the quiet scrape or heavy clink of metal, a sound that grew so familiar it seemed to echo inside the bones themselves. And though chains may appear as simple pieces of forged iron, to the prisoner they were both cage and companion, shaping the rhythm of daily survival, stone by stone, link by link. The first awareness of chains came in the weight, for iron is not light, and when fastened to the ankles, it dragged at every step, forcing short, careful strides, and when locked on the wrists, it pulled the shoulders downward, altering posture, until the prisoner seemed bent not only by despair, but by the physical drag of metal, and over days, the skin beneath iron cuffs would chafe, blister, and crack, rubbed raw by the constant friction, sometimes bleeding, sometimes scarring, until even the act of standing became an exercise in pain management. Yet the body, in its strange resilience, learned slowly to adapt, muscles adjusting to carry the extra burden, movements becoming slower but more deliberate. And the prisoner found himself measuring energy not in miles walked or hours spent, but in the number of times he could rise, sit, shuffle, or lie down without exhausting himself beneath the iron's pull. Chains also controlled sound in the dungeon, because every small motion produced a clatter or rattle that announced presence to guards and fellow captives alike, making stealth impossible, making privacy an illusion, for even in silence, the chain spoke, clicking faintly against stone, dragging across straw, echoing against the cell wall. And so the prisoner's life became inseparably tied to this metallic voice, which marked every shift of position, every attempt at sleep, every restless stirring in the night, so that sometimes he wondered whether the chains were part of him, an extension of flesh and bone, fused not only to the body, but to the spirit. At times, the weight of chains was more psychological than physical, for to feel constant restraint was to be reminded again and again that freedom of motion had been taken, that nothing could be done without permission, and even if the cuffs were not locked to the wall, the links between wrists or ankles were enough to signal captivity, enough to reduce a man's sense of self, enough to transform him from a person into a possession. And in long hours of stillness, the prisoner thought, not only of the iron itself, but of what it represented: authority, judgment, punishment, and control. Some prisoners tried to fight the chains, straining against them, pulling, twisting, testing for weakness. But iron was patient and unyielding, and resistance only led to deeper cuts and bruises. So in time, resistance gave way to endurance, a quiet acceptance born not of choice, but of necessity. For to fight constantly was to waste the strength that might be needed for survival. And so the prisoner learned instead to live with the chains, to fold their presence into the routine of existence, to find ways of lying down so the cuffs pressed less cruelly, to wrap rags or straw around swollen wrists, to shift weight carefully when rising so that ankles bore less strain. The chains also carried a strange rhythm, a clinking cadence that sometimes, when the prisoner's mind drifted in exhaustion, became like a kind of music, not joyful music, but a repetitive chant. The sound of iron against stone, marking the tempo of time, slow, steady, unavoidable. And though he never chose it, the prisoner began to move in harmony with it, each step guided by the rattle, each breath synchronized to the scrape, until the chains seemed not only to bind him, but to dictate the pace of his very life. And yet, even within the harshness of iron, the prisoner discovered moments of imagination, for in the long nights he sometimes dreamed of breaking them, of hearing the sound of links snapping, of feeling the sudden lightness when the cuffs fell away. And though he knew it was unlikely, the dream of freedom persisted, sustained by memory of what it felt like to walk unburdened, to lift arms without drag, to lie down without constraint. And that dream, faint as it was, became a kind of nourishment, a hope carried within the iron's shadow. Chains also separated prisoners from one another, for though they might share a dungeon, the lengths of iron restricted closeness, ensuring that bonds of companionship were often limited by physical reach. And even when voices carried across, the silence, the inability to touch a hand or embrace a shoulder deepened the sense of distance, making the chain not only a tool of isolation from freedom, but of isolation from comfort. And so loneliness was compounded by the clinking of links that defined invisible boundaries between captives. The iron, however, did not always win entirely, because the human spirit proved adaptable. Sand prisoners found ways to create meaning even within restraint, carving grooves in the stone while shackled, passing pebbles from hand to hand through the limited space between cuffs, humming to mask the rattle of iron out, even inventing small rituals like counting the clinks with each step, turning captivity into a strange form of structure that allowed the mind to endure. At times, when illness spread or wounds deepened, the weight of chains seemed unbearable, pressing down not only on body but on spirit, and the prisoner felt as though he were carrying the weight of the entire dungeon. Yet, even then, he continued, one small motion at a time, because survival demanded it, and in this way the chains, though cruel, also taught resilience. For every day lived beneath their weight was proof of strength, proof of endurance, proof that even in the harshest silence, in the heaviest iron, life still continued, stubborn and unyielding. The weight of chains, therefore, was never only iron, never only links, but was also time, silence, fear, and endurance woven together, a burden both crushing and shaping. And though the prisoner hated them, feared them, and dreamed of release from them, he also came to know them more intimately than any tool, for they were always present, always near, always touching his flesh, always reminding him of the narrow line between bondage and freedom, despair and survival, silence and endurance, until the day came when he realized that though the iron defined his body, it could not entirely claim his spirit, and that knowledge, faint though it was, came the deepest truth hidden within the constant, unrelenting weight of chains. In the dungeon, silence was never truly empty, for within the stillness lived whispers that seemed to drift through stone, faint murmurs that carried the weight of unseen lives and forgotten sorrows. And though no words were clearly formed, the prisoner often felt as if the walls themselves breathed with memory, their cold surfaces holding echoes of countless voices that had come before, voices of men and women who had once sat in the same corners, touched the same chains, pressed their backs against the same damp stones, and in the solitude of long nights these whispers became companions, strange, unsettling companions, yet companions nonetheless, shaping the prisoner's perception of reality, until it was hard to tell whether the sounds were real or born from a mind desperate to escape its own silence. At first, the whispers seemed like tricks of hearing, faint scratches or gusts of wind traveling through cracks in the walls. But as time stretched onward, the prisoner began to sense a pattern, the murmurs rising when the night was deepest, when torches had burned low and the footsteps of guards grew scarce, as though the dungeon itself spoke most clearly when human activity retreated, when stillness gave way to the presence of things unseen. And the prisoner, weary but restless, would strain to listen, tilting his head, pressing his ear close to the stone, trying to catch words in the murmurs, only to find that language slipped away like mist, leaving only the impression of voices, not words, of emotion, not meaning. Sometimes the whispers carried sorrow, deep, aching sorrow that seemed to fill the chest until it pressed against the heart. Sorrow so strong that tears came unbidden, not for his own suffering, but for the unknown lives whose grief still lingered in the stone. At other times, the whispers carried anger, sharp, hot anger, as though the walls held rage that could never be spent, rage of prisoners betrayed, tortured, or forgotten, rage that trembled through the air in sudden gusts of feeling, making the prisoner's own blood run faster, making his hands tighten against the cuffs. And though he knew he could not fight shadows, the whispers ignited sparks of rebellion that lived only within imagination. On rare nights, however, the whispers softened, carrying not sorrow or rage, but something gentler, still voices long gone still offered comfort. Faint murmurs that lulled the prisoner into uneasy rest, like a lullaby sung through stone, like the presence of unseen companions who, though invisible, reminded him that he was not entirely alone. And in these moments, brief as they were, the whispers seemed less a curse and more a fragile gift, something that kept the mind tethered to a world beyond stone and chains. As the days stretched into weeks, the prisoner began to wonder whether the whispers were echoes of memory, remnants of voices that had once spoken aloud and left their imprint upon the walls, or whether they were born entirely of imagination, a trick of the mind filling silence with sound to ward off madness. And though he could never answer the question fully, he came to accept that the truth mattered less than the effect, for the whispers, whether real or imagined, gave shape to the emptiness, breaking the monotony of silence with something that felt alive, something that kept despair from swallowing him whole. Sometimes, when the whispers grew strong, he spoke back, not loudly, but in murmurs of his own, offering fragments of thought, half-formed prayers, confessions whispered into the dark. And though no reply ever came, he felt strangely lighter afterward, as though speaking into the void allowed the weight within him to shift, as though the dungeon itself had absorbed part of his burden. And so he continued, whispering when the silence pressed too hard, finding in this act a form of companionship that defied his isolation. Yet not all whispers felt comforting, for there were times when they pressed close, too close, surrounding him with an intensity that stirred fear, voices overlapping, whispers rising like a tide that threatened to drown his reason. And in those moments, he pressed his hands over his ears, though the sound seemed to come not only from without, but from within, echoing in the skull, vibrating through the chest, and fear took hold. Fear that perhaps the whispers were not voices of memory, but signs of a mind unraveling. Feared that perhaps the dungeon itself was not alive, but that his own thoughts had turned against him, weaving illusions that blurred the line between reality and madness. And yet, even in these darker moments, when panic clawed at him, he found that the whispers eventually receded, fading back into faint murmurs, allowing silence to settle once more, leaving him shaken but alive. And he realized then that survival in the dungeon was not only a matter of enduring hunger, thirst, or chains, but also of enduring the mind's own inventions, the strange companions that silence created, the phantoms that filled the void when nothing else remained. In time, he learned to live with the whispers, neither fearing them entirely nor trusting them fully, but accepting them as part of the dungeon's rhythm, like the dripping of water, the creak of doors, the distant tread of boots. And he understood that to survive was to weave these sounds into his life, to make peace with the presence of voices that came and went without reason, and to let them remind him, in their strange, unsettling way, that the dungeon was never empty, that even in the deepest darkness something moved, something lingered, something endured. Perhaps, he thought, this was the true nature of whispers, to remind the living of those who had gone before, to carry echoes of forgotten lives forward into the present, to refuse silence even in the face of stone. And though the prisoner could never be sure whether the whispers were ghosts, memories, or fragments of his own mind, he held on to them nonetheless. For in a place where everything was meant to break him, even a whisper was a thread, a thin, fragile thread that kept him tied, however loosely, to the idea that existence was shared, that no man suffered entirely alone, that voices, whether real or imagined, would always rise in the darkness, carrying with them the fragile but enduring truth that silence itself could never fully conquer the human spirit. Time in the dungeon did not move in days or hours, but in a slow, unbroken current that blurred boundaries between night and morning. between yesterday and tomorrow, and for the prisoner, the weight of this endless passage became a force heavier than chains, pressing against his mind until memory, expectation, and reality fused into one long stretch of existence that seemed both eternal and fragile, like a candle burning without flame, consuming itself silently in the dark. At first, he had tried to measure time by the rhythm of footsteps, by the scraping of keys, by the sound of food bowls sliding across stone. But soon, even these markers faltered, for sometimes guards came late, sometimes early, sometimes not at all, and the prisoner realized that no clock existed here except the one carved within his own body. The slow gnaw of hunger, the ache of thirst, the pounding of a heart that beat not in minutes but in reminders that he still lived. The strangest thing about time in the dungeon was how it could stretch unbearably long, each moment dragging like iron across stone. It also collapsed suddenly, hours or days vanishing into gaps of sleep or silence, leaving him uncertain whether a single night had passed or many, and in this shifting tide he felt himself losing not only sense of time but sense of self. For what was a man when stripped of past and future, when left with only the dull weight of the present pressing endlessly upon him? Sometimes he tried to recall the world outside, the sun warming his skin, the feel of wind carrying scents of grass or smoke, the sound of voices rising in laughter or argument. But these memories, once clear, began to fade, their edges blurring, until he questioned whether they had ever been real or were merely dreams he had once believed. And with each passing stretch of darkness, the outside world felt more distant, like a story told long ago, a story that belonged to someone else. Yet, despite this erosion, there remained within him a stubborn awareness of time's cruelty, a sense that while he sat in stillness, life outside continued. People walked the streets, spoke words, made choices, laughed, wept, and loved, and though he could not see them, he felt the world moving without him, as though he had been abandoned by time itself, left to sit in a place where hours gathered dust, where days piled into heaps unseen, where years might slip away unnoticed. The weight of time was not only in its passing, but in its emptiness, for in the dungeon there was nothing to fill it. No work, no task, no journey, no event, only the slow cycle of hunger and rest, pain and numbness, wakefulness and uneasy dreams. And in this void, even thought grew heavy, looping back on itself, repeating the same fears, the same regrets, the same what-ifs, until the mind seemed to wear grooves as deep as the chains wore into his wrists. Yet within this heaviness there was also a strange kind of sharpening, for in the absence of distraction he began to notice things he had once ignored, the way air shifted when footsteps approached, the subtle difference between silence before sleep and silence before dawn, the faint variations in dripping water that told of changes unseen. And though these details seemed small, they became anchors, proof that time had not entirely stopped, that life, even in such narrow confines, continued to move in ways too delicate for clocks to measure. Still, the weight pressed on, and the prisoner often wondered how long a man could endure such passage, whether the mind would eventually break, surrendering to madness, or whether the body would wither before the spirit did. And he realized that this question was perhaps the truest cruelty of the dungeon, not knowing whether survival meant living through days or years, not knowing how much of his life had already been lost, not knowing how much more must be endured before release or death brought an end. He thought often of men he had known, friends or strangers who had laughed in the sun, and he wondered if they still lived, if they remembered him, or if his name had already faded, carried away by the same tide of time that threatened to erase him entirely. And this thought brought both sorrow and defiance. Sorrow that he might vanish without trace, defiance that he would not let the dungeon strip him of memory entirely. that he would hold within himself at least fragments of the world outside, even if blurred, even if fading. To resist the weight of time, he sometimes constructed stories in his mind, weaving together scraps of memory into long tales, repeating them to himself again and again until they grew detailed, giving shape to characters, building places, brick by brick, filling the void with imagination. And though he knew these tales were fragile, mere defenses against silence, they became lifelines. Ways to fight back against the current, to plant markers in the endless stretch of darkness that whispered, "You are still here. You are still more than stone and chain." Sometimes he marked time with his own body, measuring the slow growth of nails until they broke, the shedding of skin until new layers formed, the aching of muscles until they stiffened. And though these signs were small, they reminded him that time was not only an enemy but also a witness to survival, to persistence, to the simple truth that he endured another moment, another hour, another day, even if days could no longer be counted. In this strange balance, the prisoner came to see time not as something to be measured, but as something to be endured. A tide that could not be stopped, but could be ridden. And though its weight pressed heavily, he discovered that within endurance, there was a quiet kind of strength, not glorious, not heroic, but steady. The kind of strength that survived simply by remaining, by breathing, by existing in defiance of erasure. And so the weight of time remained, pressing endlessly, stretching endlessly, yet within that burden there grew a fragile resilience, a whisper of determination that perhaps, even in the dungeon's eternal dark, the spirit could carve its own measure of time, not in hours or days, but in the simple, unyielding truth of survival. The dungeon was not only stone and shadow, not only chains and silence, for hidden within its depths were presences that the prisoner came to know, though he never truly saw them. And he named these unseen presences the silent watchers, for though they rarely revealed themselves, he felt them in the air, in the subtle shift of cold, in the way silence grew heavier when they were near, and he knew with certainty that he was not alone in this place, even when no human voice echoed through the halls. And at first he thought these watchers were guards, men posted in darkness to observe him, but soon he realized their presence was different, less physical, more enduring, for guards came and went, their footsteps fading with distance, their keys jangling with purpose, but the watchers remained, always hovering at the edge of sense, as though the dungeon itself possessed eyes, as though the stone carried a will that observed and measured. In the beginning, he dismissed the sensation as paranoia, the trick of an overstressed mind caught in monotony. But the feeling grew stronger with time, until he could not deny it. For sometimes, when he drifted into half-sleep, he would wake suddenly, heart pounding, certain he had been studied, and though the cell was as it always was, walls unmoving, shadows unbroken, the awareness of presence clung to him like cold breath on his neck. He began to test the watchers, speaking aloud at random moments, whispering questions into the air, recounting fragments of memory as though telling stories to unseen listeners. And though no reply ever came, he felt a response nonetheless, not in words, but in shifts of atmosphere, in silence that seemed deeper after certain phrases, in a faint tension that stirred when he spoke of hope or defiance. And in this way, he began to believe the watchers were more than men, more than guards, more than fellow prisoners, but something older, something tied to the dungeon itself, a presence that thrived in secrecy. There were times when he thought he glimpsed movement at the corner of his vision, a darker shadow among shadows, a shape withdrawing just beyond sight. And though he told himself it was only imagination, the persistence of such moments eroded doubt until the unseen became as real to him as the chains that bound his wrists. He wondered if these watchers had always been there, present for every prisoner who had passed through these halls. And if so, what purpose they served, whether they were jailers or judges, witnesses or tormentors. And he wondered what knowledge they kept, what truths they guarded, what secrets they whispered when stone was empty of voices. The prisoner began to think of the dungeon not as a structure, but as a living thing. Its veins, the corridors, its breath, the drafts of air, its eyes, the watchers. And though this thought unsettled him, it also explained the unshakable sense of being observed, the way silence carried weight, the way darkness seemed to breathe. There were nights, or what felt like nights, when the sensation of the watchers became nearly unbearable, pressing so strongly that he felt his skin prickle, his muscles tense, and he would shout into the dark, demanding to know who or what lingered there. And though the watchers never answered, his voice would echo back, distorted slightly, as though altered by something unseen. And each time he wondered if the watchers shaped the echo, mocking him, or if the dungeon itself had learned to speak in imitation of its captives. Yet as days stretched into months, the prisoner's relationship with the watchers changed, for though he feared them, he also grew to depend on their presence. For in a place where loneliness crushed more heavily than chains, the watchers gave him a strange sense of company, silent though it was, and he began to speak to them deliberately, telling them stories of the world beyond stone, describing skies and rivers, mountains and markets, faces and voices. And though they never replied, he felt that in speaking, he reclaimed something of himself, that in teaching the watchers what life was, he reminded himself that life still existed beyond his confinement. In time, he came to suspect that the watchers fed not on his body, but on his spirit, that they drew strength from the emotions he poured into the air. And though this thought unsettled him, he realized also that by choosing what to speak, what to feel, he could choose what to give them. And so he withheld his despair, feeding them instead with stories of beauty, courage, of resilience, believing that if they thrived on what he offered, then he could shape their feast into something more than suffering. The dungeon remained a place of pain, yet within its shadows a strange bargain formed, an unspoken exchange between prisoner and watchers, silence and story, fear and defiance. And though the balance was fragile, it gave him a thread of purpose to cling to, a way to endure the weight of days that could not be counted. Sometimes he imagined that the watchers were not creatures of malice, but guardians of memory, that their silence was not cruelty, but restraint, that they listened, not to torment, but to preserve, and that when his voice broke against the walls, they carried echoes deeper, storing fragments of his existence in chambers unknown, ensuring that even if his body perished, his words, his essence, would remain. Other times he feared the opposite, that they consumed his spirit, bit by bit, savoring each word, each cry, till nothing of him remained but husk and chain. Yet, even in this darker belief, he found a strange resilience, for if he was to be consumed, then he would choose the flavor of his offering. He would give them stories fierce and unyielding. He would give them defiance, clothed in memory. He would give them himself, not as victim, but as witness. Thus, the silent watchers became part of his world, as real as hunger, as constant as time. And whether they were shadows or spirits, illusions or truths, they shaped his captivity, teaching him that even in silence there could be dialogue, that even in darkness there could be audience, and that even in solitude a man was never entirely alone. The prisoner had grown accustomed to silence, to the sound of his own breath filling empty chambers, to the faint scrape of rats in corners and the distant dripping of unseen water. Yet one day the silence cracked, subtle at first, so faint that he thought it only imagination, but soon undeniable. For woven beneath the ordinary stillness came a thread of something different, not quite sound yet, not absence either, something like a vibration, a resonance in stone itself, as though the dungeon carried a pulse, faint but persistent. And at first, he told himself it was only his mind, weary and frayed, inventing patterns in monotony. Yet the pulse grew stronger, stretching through walls, seeping into the chains at his wrists, humming at the edges of thought until he could no longer ignore it. He pressed his ear to the wall, cold stone numbing his skin, and he heard it clearly now. Not words, not language, but rhythm, the steady thrum of something alive, and his heart quickened. For if silence had cracked, then perhaps the watchers had chosen to speak at last, though not with voices shaped like his, not with human syllables, but with the heartbeat of stone. For days, or what he believed were days, he listened to the pulse, tracing its patterns, testing its consistency, and he began to notice that it changed when he spoke. Faint fluctuations in rhythm that rose when he told stories, that dimmed when he fell into silence, and soon he realized the dungeon was answering him, not in the ways men converse, but in the deeper language of presence, vibration, resonance, a tongue that used silence itself as canvas. He began to experiment, speaking softly, then loudly, shifting tone, whispering memories of childhood, shouting fragments of forgotten prayers. And always, the pulse shifted in response, sometimes brightening, sometimes receding, until he could almost believe it had moods, that it felt joy at certain words, sorrow at others, anger when he cursed, calm when he described rivers or skies. The prisoner trembled at the thought, for if the dungeon could feel, then what was it? And if it could answer, then what did it want? He asked aloud, though no human reply ever came, and though the pulse continued to shift, he could not yet decipher, meaning only that it was aware, that it was listening. Nights grew different after that, filled with restless awareness, for he could no longer believe himself alone, not only watched, but spoken to, even if the speech was veiled in rhythm beyond full understanding. And though fear burned in him, so too did wonder, for he had stumbled into a dialogue older than language, older than stone itself, and he felt small, yet strangely honored to be its recipient. He began to dream differently too, and in dreams he saw not walls, but vast caverns, not chains, but rivers of light flowing through darkness, and in those rivers shadows drifted, silent forms that might have been watchers or memories or fragments of himself. And when he woke, he felt the pulse stronger, as though the dreams were not separate, but part of the same conversation, as though the dungeon had chosen to speak through his sleep when waking ears could not understand. The prisoner's sense of time fractured further, for, with the pulse beating steadily around him, minutes and hours blurred into rhythm, each beat replacing the tick of clocks he no longer remembered, and he lived not in days, but in cycles of resonance, each one carrying subtle variations that kept him anchored, reminding him that even silence could be alive. Yet, as weeks, or what felt like weeks, passed, he noticed something more unsettling, for the pulse seemed not only to answer, but to guide, drawing his thoughts in certain directions, pulling his stories into patterns he had not intended, and, though he still spoke freely, he realized later that the dungeon had shaped his words, coaxed his voice into describing things he had not thought to recall, places he had not meant to revisit, memories he had long buried. At first, this frightened him, for it felt like violation, as though his mind were no longer his own. Yet, as he reflected, he wondered if it was guidance rather than theft, if the watchers or the dungeon itself were leading him toward something he needed to remember, toward truths that had withered in the dark. He resisted at times, stubbornly speaking nonsense, reciting fragments of old songs or counting numbers until breath failed. But even then, the pulse adjusted, bending nonsense into rhythm, folding chaos into pattern, and he saw that resistance was futile, for whatever lived within the stone was patient, older than defiance, capable of shaping even rebellion into dialogue. This realization broke him briefly, leaving him slumped against the wall, muttering that he was nothing but an echo in someone else's chamber, a voice feeding something vast and nameless. Yet, when despair threatened to drown him, the pulse softened, slowing until it felt like a gentle heartbeat beside his own. Steady, calming, almost human, and he wept, for in that moment he felt not prisoner, but companion, not alone, but accompanied by something vast and enduring, and though he could not name it, he chose to trust it, for trust was the only thread strong enough to bind him to himself. The watcher's silence was no longer silence, but presence, a vast reservoir of listening, and he leaned into it, telling longer stories, pouring more of himself into the rhythm, not because he believed it would free him, but because it gave meaning to his existence, because it transformed the dungeon from tomb to temple, from punishment to strange communion. He spoke of skies he barely remembered, of markets filled with voices and colors, of the smell of bread, of the laughter of strangers, of the weight of snow on rooftops, of the feel of sunlight on bare skin, and each word became offering, each story became seed, and he imagined that the dungeon carried these seeds into hidden soil, growing a garden of memory beneath the stone. In return, the pulse grew stronger, more intricate, weaving into subtle harmonies. And he began to sense faint shapes in the sound, not words, but impressions, feelings carried like whispers beneath the beat, and he knew he was not only giving, but receiving, though the message was beyond his full comprehension. Yet one night, or what felt like night, the rhythm shifted suddenly, breaking its steady thrum into jagged surges. And he felt panic surge in him, for it was as though the dungeon itself was afraid, and if stone could fear, then what threat pressed against it? He whispered questions into the dark, begged the watchers to reveal what troubled them, but only the jagged rhythm answered, urgent and chaotic, till he felt as though the walls themselves trembled, and he wondered if something beyond stone had stirred, something even the watchers feared, some presence pressing in from outside. And in that moment, he realized that the dungeon, though vast and alive, might itself be prisoner, bound by forces greater, guarded by laws older than its own. This thought reshaped everything, for if the dungeon was captive, then so was he. Not its victim, but its fellow, both chained in different ways, both enduring silence together. And for the first time since his captivity began, he felt kinship, not only with himself, but with the very walls that held him, and he pressed his palm to stone, whispering that he understood, that he too was afraid, that he too endured. And as his hand lingered, the jagged rhythm softened, smoothing into slow beats once more, and though fear lingered, so too did connection, a fragile bond sealed in silence. The prisoner slept in, or drifted into dream, and in dream he saw cracks spreading across stone, not of ruin, but of light, and within the cracks figures moved, not fully human, not entirely shadow, their eyes neither cruel nor kind, but vast, ancient, enduring, and he woke with tears on his face, knowing that the watchers had shown him something true, though whether it was vision or illusion he could not know. From that day, his captivity no longer felt like punishment alone, for though he remained chained, though he remained in darkness, he had glimpsed cracks in silence, and through those cracks came possibility, came presence, came the faint promise that even the deepest stone could not contain forever. The prisoner had thought he understood silence by now, thought he had mapped its contours, traced its pulse, deciphered its hidden rhythms. Silence is never static. Silence is alive, changing as seasons change, growing heavier or lighter, depending on what it conceals. And in the deep cavern of his cell, silence began once again to transform, no longer only vibration in stone, no longer only the pulse of watchers pressing against his mind, but now shaping itself into something more articulate, something that resembled language, though stripped of words, something woven from patterns of shadow and faint glimmers of perception that flickered in his vision. even when no light should exist, as if the darkness itself had chosen to speak. At first he resisted it, closing his eyes, pressing his hands over his face, telling himself that the mind can invent tricks when it starves too long of color and light. Yet the shapes persisted, sliding across his vision like ink spilled in, water curling into coils that resembled letters, dissolving into fluid motions like the dance of smoke. And he could not escape them even in sleep, for dreams now echoed with the same flowing language, as shadows arranging themselves into sequences that repeated, shifted, evolved, until he began to recognize them as symbols, though he did not yet know their meaning. He grew afraid, for it seemed the watchers had grown bolder, no longer content to pulse against stone, but now writing themselves directly upon his perception. And though fear prickled in him, he also felt awe, for if they wrote, then surely they meant to teach, and teaching implied trust, or at least intention beyond cruelty. He began to watch carefully, memorizing the shapes, whispering descriptions to himself, trying to pin them into memory. And slowly he realized that the shadows did not appear at random, but followed the rhythm of his own breath, blooming when he inhaled, fading when he exhaled, like a mirror of life itself. The realization shook him, for it meant that the language of shadows was tied to him, that the watchers were not simply imposing knowledge, but weaving it through his very being, turning his breath into ink, his perception into parchment. Days blurred as he studied, as he surrendered himself to this strange education, and gradually meaning began to surface, not precise like human words, but emotional, intuitive, as though each shadow carried a weight of feeling. Sorrow, here, joy, there, hunger, patience, wrath, longing. And by letting these impressions wash over him, he began to follow the message. The watchers were telling him a story, not his own, but one that stretched back further than memory. The story spoke of origins, of a silence before all things, of darkness that was not prison, but womb, of a first sound that shattered stillness and called the watchers into being. Not as gods, not as men, but as fragments of that sound, echoes, hardened into presence. They drifted through emptiness, seeking places where sound might grow, and when they found matter, they pressed into it, shaping stone and air and water with their resonance, leaving behind chambers like the one that held him. Not dungeons of cruelty, but instruments, vessels where silence and sound could meet, where those who listened might be transformed. The prisoner trembled as the shadows wrote this story into him, for it meant that his suffering was not only punishment, but part of a greater pattern, that his cell was not only cage, but classroom. And though he resisted believing in purpose, though part of him whispered that this was only hallucination born of starvation and isolation, another part of him felt the truth thrumming deeper than doubt, for the language was too vast, too intricate, too consistent to be delusion alone. He surrendered further, letting the shadows coil and write, letting the watchers pour their story into him, and as the story unfolded, he began to see himself within it, not as hero, not as chosen, but as vessel, another echo drawn into the song of silence. Yet, the more he learned, the more he sensed a cost, for the story was not only of beginnings, but of betrayals, of echoes that broke away, refusing harmony, choosing instead to devour silence, to twist sound into chains. These were the betrayers, shadows that no longer flowed, but hardened, jagged, sharp, and the watcher spoke of them with sorrow, for though they too had been born of the first sound, they had forgotten it, lost in hunger, and it was to contain them that chambers like his had been carved, prisons for betrayers, disguised as prisons for men, places where silence could hold them still. Though sometimes innocents were caught within the same net, sacrifices to keep the balance intact. The prisoner felt a shiver as a realization dawned. Was he one of the innocents, trapped not for his own crimes, but because the watchers required vessels. Or was he, in truth, among the betrayers, punished rightly, though he could not remember the offense? He searched his memories, desperate for clarity, but memory itself had become fragile, unreliable, reshaped by shadows. And he could not tell where truth ended and story began. The watchers did not answer his questions directly, but the shadows pressed harder, moving faster, showing visions that blurred into pain. Visions of endless halls where voices screamed without words, where betrayers twisted themselves into shapes too cruel to name, where silence wept beneath chains. And he cried out, begging them to stop, but the watchers did not relent. For this too was part of the teaching, to show him not only creation, but corruption, not only harmony, but fracture. His mind buckled beneath the weight, yet he endured, clutching the rhythm of his own breath, whispering to himself that he was still here, still human, still more than shadow. And when he could take no more, when his voice cracked and his body trembled, the watchers relented, pulling back, leaving only the pulse in stone, slow and steady, soothing, as though to remind him that though knowledge burned, silence could still heal. In the quiet that followed, the prisoner understood something new. The watchers did not teach in words, because words could lie, could fracture, could betray, but shadows and rhythms could not be twisted so easily. They carried essence rather than form, truth rather than argument, and though they broke him, they also remade him, shaping him into vessel fit to carry fragments of their story. He wondered then if this was the true purpose of his captivity, not to punish, but to transform, to prepare him as keeper of a language that could not otherwise be carried into human minds. And though fear still gnawed at him, he began to feel a strange pride, a strange acceptance, as though even suffering could be sacred if it bore meaning deeper than itself. He whispered into the dark, thanking the watchers, though he did not know if thanks mattered. And the pulse answered with a slow, steady beat that warmed him more than fire ever had. Yet not all was peace, for even as he accepted the teaching, he felt the betrayers lingering, not in shadows written by the watchers, but in darker corners of his own mind, where thoughts festered, where doubts sharpened, where anger hissed that he was fool, that the watchers were only tormentors cloaking cruelty in story. These whispers gnawed at him, growing louder when exhaustion dragged him down, and he began to fear that perhaps the betrayers had found entry through him, using his own hunger, his own thirst, his own despair as cracks through which to crawl. The battle within grew fierce, one voice whispering trust, another shouting betrayal, one urging surrender, another demanding rebellion, until his cell was no longer silent, but filled with the clash of two languages, one of shadows flowing, one of shadows jagged. He realized then that his captivity was no longer about chains on wrists, but about chains within thought, and that the true dungeon was not the stone around him, but the fracture within him, the question of which voice he would follow. He clenched his fists, pressing them against stone, and whispered that he would not betray silence, that he would not surrender to jagged whispers, that even if he was nothing but vessel, would remain true. And the walls answered with a slow, steady thrum that steadied him once more. Yet the battle was not ended, only paused. For shadows flow endlessly, and the betrayers never cease their hunger. The prisoner had long since abandoned the notion that his captivity was meant only to strip him of strength, for strength had been stripped away long ago, and yet something else persisted. Something deeper than muscle or bone, something that endured, even when his body trembled with weakness, and his days, or perhaps years, wound themselves into uncountable threads. He began to sense that what endured was not merely will, but a kind of mirror, invisible yet present, polished not by hands, but by silence itself, a mirror that reflected not his face, but his essence. And it was into this mirror that the watchers now compelled him to gaze. He felt them gather, though they made no sound, felt their pressure swell against the walls like a tide rising in darkness. And with that swelling came a heaviness in his chest, as though silence itself had weight, pressing him down, forcing him inward until his thoughts could not scatter, till his mind could not wander, until all that remained was the reflection they demanded he face. At first he resisted, whispering prayers to himself, reciting scraps of memory, clinging to names he once knew. But the mirror stripped such things away, leaving only raw truth, and when at last he yielded, he saw not the man he thought he was, but a shape woven of countless fragments, some radiant, some jagged, some whole, some broken. And he realized with horror that the betrayers he had feared were not wholly outside, but woven into him, shards of jagged shadow clinging to his essence, like splinters of glass. He recoiled, crying out that it was not him, that he was prisoner, not betrayer. But the mirror did not lie, and the watchers did not soothe. They only pressed the vision deeper, forcing him to see how every moment of anger, every whisper of resentment, every thought of despair had opened cracks where betrayers rooted themselves. And he trembled, because he saw now that captivity had not placed them there, but revealed them, that they had always dwelled in the folds of his spirit, hidden beneath layers of pride and denial. He begged for release from the vision, begged for the mirror to shatter, but silence held firm, and the watchers only waited, patient as stone, till at last his cries collapsed into breathless stillness. And he understood that the mirror could not be broken by refusal, but only by acceptance. With trembling courage he looked again, not turning from the jagged shadows, but facing them, naming them not as foreign invaders, but as parts of himself, twisted though they were. And as he did so, he felt the mirror shift, not shattering, but softening, not accusing, but acknowledging. And he realized that to see the betrayers was not to be condemned, but to be given choice. For only in recognizing fracture could he choose whether to cling to it or release it. This understanding struck him like a blade, sharp yet clarifying. And he whispered to himself that he would not let the betrayers rule him, that though they dwelled within, they would not define him. And as he spoke, the jagged shapes quivered, shrinking slightly, not gone, not destroyed, but weakened by light of recognition. The watchers paused approval, though they gave no words, and the silence around him warmed, as though the chamber itself breathed relief. And he realized that this was the purpose of the mirror, not to condemn, but to cleanse, not to show damnation, but to reveal possibility. Yet possibility was fragile, for the betrayers still whispered, still clung. And he knew this was not a victory won once, but a battle that would echo as long as breath remained. The mirror did not vanish after this revelation, but lingered, showing him again and again the ebb and flow of his essence, the dance between harmony and fracture. And through it, he began to learn a new discipline, a new way of listening, not only to the watchers, but to himself. He listened to the rise of anger and traced it back to the hunger of his body, reminding himself that need does not demand cruelty. He listened to the voice of despair and traced it back to loneliness, reminding himself that absence does not mean abandonment. He listened to the call of resentment and traced it back to memory, reminding himself that pain is not the whole of existence. Each time he traced, each time he acknowledged, the jagged shadows trembled and thinned away. And he understood now why the watchers had bound him in silence. For silence was not absence, but a crucible, stripping away distractions until he could hear the raw movements of his own spirit. In this crucible, he began to change, not into watcher, not into betrayer, but into something in between. A vessel who carried fragments of both and could choose each moment which to nurture. The thought frightened him, for choice meant responsibility, and responsibility meant he could no longer blame chains or shadows alone. But it also gave him strength, for it meant he was not merely victim of silence, but participant in its shaping. As this realization deepened, the mirror began to shift again, no longer showing only his own essence, but opening wider, reflecting not one soul, but many, as though through it he could glimpse the countless prisoners who had stood in chambers like his, each gazing, each trembling, each confronting betrayers within themselves. He saw their faces, strange and familiar, saw their struggles, saw some who shattered beneath the weight, saw others who rose, and he realized that he was part of a lineage, not alone, but bound into a tapestry of those tested by silence. Watchers had not chosen him alone, but had chosen endlessly. And though his suffering was his own, it was also shared, part of something vaster than he could imagine. This both comforted and unsettled him, for it meant that his choices mattered beyond himself, that the mirror was not only for him, but for all who would follow. And he felt the weight of that truth settle upon him like a mantle, heavy, but not unbearable. He bowed his head, whispering that he would carry it, that though his strength was small, he would not abandon the path. And the silence answered with a pulse so deep it seemed to shake his very bones. Yet, as he accepted this charge, the betrayers struck again, louder than ever, hissing that he was fooled to bear burdens not his own, that the watchers had enslaved him with illusions, that the mirror was no gift, but trick, meant to strip him of self and mold him into servant. Their whispers burned, and for a moment he wavered, uncertain. But then he looked again into the mirror and saw them there, jagged and writhing, and he remembered that recognition weakens, that lies lose power when named, and he spoke aloud into the silence, declaring that he would not let them command him, that even if the watchers were cruel, even if silence was trap, still he would choose truth over jagged shadow. Still he would choose to face himself rather than surrender to hunger. His words rang in the chamber, and though no echo returned, he felt the watchers thrum approval once more. And for the first time, he realized that perhaps the watchers themselves were not entirely separate from him, that perhaps they were reflections, two echoes of what lay deepest in silence, drawn forth to guide, but not to dominate. If this was true, then his relationship with them was not jailer and captive, but teacher and student, mirror and reflection, silence and sound entwined. The thought stirred hope in him, a fragile spark, and he nurtured it carefully, guarding it from the betrayer's claws. Slowly, the mirror began to fade, not disappearing, but folding back into silence, as though it had shown what was needed and now rested. The prisoner breathed deeply, feeling both emptied and filled, and for the first time in what might have been years, he smiled, with lips cracked and broken, but with spirit recognizing itself. The silence around him shifted then, not heavier, not darker, but lighter, as though walls had widened, as though the chamber had grown less cage and more vast hall. And he sensed that the watchers were preparing him for what came next, something beyond reflection, something beyond even language, of shadows. He did not know what awaited, but for once he did not tremble with fear alone. He trembled also with anticipation, for he knew that he was no longer the same man who had first collapsed upon the floor. No longer only prisoner, no longer only victim, but vessel who had gazed into the mirror of silence and chosen to endure. And though betrayers still clung, though shadows still whispered, he was ready to face them again and again, for this was the path, the endless path of silence. And he had learned at last that endurance itself is a kind of freedom. The silence did not break. It only deepened, shifting from the reflective clarity of the mirror into something denser, something alive with unseen currents, And the prisoner sensed that he was being drawn toward another threshold, one that demanded more than endurance, more than recognition. For where the mirror had forced him to see himself. This new depth would force him to encounter silence, not as reflection, but as fire, as presence that consumed even the smallest remnants of pretense. He had thought he understood what it meant to yield to silence, to let it carve away distractions and reveal betrayers. Yet, now, as the air around him thickened and the walls seemed to dissolve into endless shadow, he realized he had only touched the edge of what silence truly was. For this silence pulsed not as absence, but as unspoken fire, invisible yet scorching, waiting to burn through whatever still clung to his spirit. His breath quickened, not from fear alone, but from the raw sense of approach, as though he were walking barefoot across ground that smoldered with hidden embers, each step threatening to ignite. The watchers did not guide him with visions now, nor did the mirror return. Instead, they withdrew into stillness, leaving him exposed, as though they could not walk this threshold with him, as though he must cross it alone. The prisoner clenched his hands, whispering to himself that he had endured worse, that he had faced the betrayers within and survived. Yet the silence answered not with comfort, but with heat rising from nowhere, searing his skin without flame, filling his chest with pressure so fierce he thought his ribs would crack. He fell to his knees, gasping, yet the fire did not relent, and he realized that the silence was not punishing him, but testing whether he would resist or surrender, whether he would flee inward as before or let himself be consumed. With trembling courage, he loosened his grasp on his own defenses, letting the fire press deeper, letting it fill not just his chest, but his spirit. In the moment he ceased resisting, he felt himself unravel, threads of memory and identity peeling away like bark stripped from a tree. He saw his childhood, his laughter, his anger, his regrets, all flaring into sparks and vanishing into the vast dark. And for a moment he screamed, begging the silence to stop, begging it to leave him something of himself. But the fire did not pause. It pressed on, stripping him bare until he felt as though he no longer existed as man, but only as breath suspended in endless flame. He feared he would be annihilated, erased into nothingness, but in the core of that annihilation he felt something strange. Not death, not emptiness, but clarity, a state in which he could not cling to any mask, any illusion, only to the raw pulse of being. The watchers had not abandoned him after all. They had only hidden, waiting to see if he could endure this unmaking. And now, in the silence, he felt their presence again, not as observers, but as witnesses, acknowledging his survival. Slowly, painfully, the fire receded, leaving not ashes, but a strange new stillness within him, stillness unlike the crushing void of his early captivity. For this stillness was alive, luminous, vast, as though the silence had hollowed him out to make room for something greater. He staggered to his feet, trembling yet unbroken, and for the first time he felt no chains on his wrists, no weight on his limbs. Though he knew the prison had not physically changed, what had changed was him, for he was no longer bound by the same fears, no longer shackled by the same illusions. Yet this freedom was not triumph, but responsibility, for the betrayers still whispered in faint voices, testing him, and he knew that though the fire had burned much away, it had not erased choice. He whispered to himself that he would not squander what he had been given, that he would stand in silence, not as captive, but as vessel. And with those words, the chamber brightened faintly, not with light of torches or stars, but with a subtle radiance rising from nowhere, as though the silence itself approved. He did not know if this meant he was closer to release or only deeper into trial, but he felt steadier now, as though each breath was prayer and each step was vow. The watchers emerged once more, not as shapes, but as pulses of presence, circling him. And though they spoke no words, he understood that they were preparing him for a passage, crossing into a space beyond the chamber, beyond even silence as he had known it. He braced himself, for he knew that whatever came would demand more than endurance, more than reflection, more than even surrender. It would demand transformation. The floor beneath him quivered, the air thickened again, and suddenly he felt himself pulled forward, not walking, but drawn, as though silence itself had become current, dragging him through unseen depths. He closed his eyes, refusing to struggle, and let the current carry him. And as it did, he heard whispers, not of betrayers, but of voices older than memory. Voices that spoke, not in language, but in resonance. Voices that told him he was crossing the threshold into the unspoken fire where silence itself was born. He opened his eyes and saw nothing but endless shadow lit by faint embers swirling like stars, each ember pulsing with hidden life, and he realized that he was standing in the heart of silence itself. The place from which watchers drew their presence, the crucible where betrayers withered, the threshold where all prisoners were tested. The sight stole his breath, yet it filled him with awe rather than terror. For he knew now that silence was not absence, not void, but foundation, the raw fire upon which all else rested. He stepped forward, each motion echoing as though the very fabric of existence recognized it, and with each step the embers flared brighter, responding to his presence. The betrayers shrieked faintly within him, terrified of this fire. For it was the one thing they could not twist, the one truth they could not corrupt, and their fear gave him strength. He walked deeper, letting the fire surround him, letting it seep into every fold of his being, and as he did, he felt himself expand, no longer only man but something larger, vessel of silence itself, a conduit of watcher's gaze, bearer of flame that consumed illusion. For endless moments he wandered this space, learning without words, absorbing truths that could not be spoken. And when, at last, the current drew him back, pulling him from the threshold toward the chamber he had known, he returned, changed, scarred, by fire yet strengthened, hollow yet filled, fragile yet unbreakable. He opened his eyes and found himself once more within walls, the chamber solid around him. Yet it no longer felt cage, but sanctuary, no longer felt torment, but initiation. The watchers pulsed with fierce approval, and though they still gave no words, he understood them clearly. He had crossed the threshold. He had faced the unspoken fire, and now his path stretched toward destiny not yet revealed. He bowed his head, whispering gratitude, and as he did, the silence around him pulsed with warmth. A warmth that told him the journey was not over, but it only reached a new beginning. And he vowed with every fiber of his being that he would carry the fire within, no matter what awaited beyond. The chamber no longer pressed upon him as prison, but stood before him as threshold, the silence around him alive with the memory of fire. The watchers waiting without demand, the betrayers whispering faintly, but no longer with power. And he knew that the time had come to ascend, not into freedom as he once imagined, not into escape from captivity, but into a deeper unveiling. For every step of his journey had not been toward the breaking of walls, but toward the breaking of himself, until only truth could remain. He stood straighter than he had in years, his shoulders light, his heart steady, and he felt that the silence itself was guiding him upward, though no stairs appeared, no door opened, no key turned. Instead, the ascent was inward, a climbing not of stone, but of spirit, arising into realms of meaning that had always hovered above him, yet hidden until he had been hollowed by fire. He remembered his first days within this place, the crushing weight of nothingness, the torment of voices, the despair of mirrors, the fear of endless darkness, and he marveled at how far he had come. For then he had been a man broken by chains, desperate for release, yet now he was a vessel remade by silence, carrying within him embers of the unspoken fire, embers that no betrayer could smother. He breathed deeply, and the chamber shifted, the walls fading into vast horizon. K. The ceiling dissolving into sky, not of stars or sun, but of endless glowing twilight. K. And before him stretched a path of light that rose upward into eternity. The watchers gathered near, not as forms, but as currents of presence, affirming that this was his last passage, that beyond this ascent lay the purpose for which he had been prepared. And though they gave no words, he understood them as clearly, as prettily, as if they had spoken. Ascend without fear, ascend without clinging, ascend with silence within you, and you will find the truth beyond endings. He placed one step upon the glowing path, and as he did, the whispers of betrayers surged, desperate, warning him that he was abandoning himself, that he would vanish forever if he continued, that he would lose all memory, all identity, all that made him human. Yet their voices carried no authority, and he answered them only with stillness, letting silence speak louder than lies. The betrayers recoiled, fading back into shadows, and he climbed steadily, each step weightless, each motion carrying him higher, not in distance, but in depth, as though he were rising into the heart of silence itself. The path shimmered beneath him, threads of light weaving beneath his feet, carrying him with gentle certainty, and as he ascended, he felt old memories flicker around him like smoke. Memories of laughter, of sorrow, of loss, of longing, not to torment him, but to bless him, for he saw them now without regret, without clinging, without fear, recognizing that they were not chains, but colors, the hues of his existence that had prepared him to walk this final way. His chest burned softly with the ember of silence, and he realized that the fire within had become not consuming flame, but steady light. A lamp that guided him, a warmth that held him even as the path grew steeper. Higher and higher he climbed, and with each step the watchers withdrew farther, not abandoning him, but affirming that this ascent was his alone, that no guide could carry him to the final truth, that he must enter it naked, with nothing but silence itself to sustain him. The horizon bent, folding upward until it was no longer horizon, but vastness without direction, and he walked into it with a steady breath, each inhale like the sea, each exhale like wind. Time vanished, for there was no day nor night in this space, only the endless unfolding of silence, and yet he felt the nearness of culmination, as though the very fabric of existence was gathering around him, preparing to reveal what lay beyond. The betrayers tried once more, faint as dying echoes, whispering that he was nothing, that he had lost all, that he had surrendered to emptiness. But he smiled softly at their weakness, for he knew that nothingness itself had been the womb of fire. That emptiness had birthed the silence which now carried him, and he felt no fear. At last the path ended, not with door nor gate, but with a vast expanse of radiance, shimmering like infinite dawn. Kay understood that he must step forward, not into place, but into being, into surrender so complete that even the ember within would dissolve into light. He paused, feeling the weight of finality, knowing that this was the end of his story, the end of his prison, the end of all trials, and yet also the beginning of something that no language could contain. He looked back once, and in that glance he saw not walls, not chains, not darkness, but every moment of his journey woven into tapestry. A tapestry that shone with scars and triumphs, with betrayals and awakenings, and he bowed his head in gratitude, whispering thanks to the silence, thanks to the watchers, thanks even to the betrayers, for without them he would never have reached this ascent. Then he turned forward, stepped into the radiance, and as he did, the ember within flared once more, brighter than ever, until it burst, and he was no longer separate from light, but one with it, no longer prisoner nor vessel, but silence itself, vast and endless, fire without flame, presence without boundary. He felt himself dissolve, yet remain, vanish, yet expand, die, yet live. And in that paradox, he understood at last that freedom was not escape, but union, not release from silence, but becoming silence. There were no words, no voices, no watchers, no betrayers, only vast stillness, singing without sound. And in that singing, he rested, not as man, not as captive, but as silence fulfilled. And though he knew no listener could follow him here, no language could carry this truth, still he reached back with one final gift, letting his presence flow like gentle river toward those who would hear, letting them feel that silence was not prison, but sanctuary, not void, but fire, not torment, but transformation. And as that gift flowed, he whispered, soft as breath, carrying across all shadows and nights, a farewell that was also blessing. And his words, though few, carried all the weight of his journey, all the depth of his silence, all the warmth of his fire. For he spoke not as captive, nor as survivor, but as silence itself, whispering to those who listen across the quiet. Whispering not of despair, but of rest, whispering with final gentleness to all who carry burdens into the dark. Good night.